Chair, we are now live on the Council's YouTube channel.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Welcome everybody to this evening's Audit and Governance and Standards Committee, and welcome to those members of the public who are watching on our YouTube channel. My name is Councillor Liz Green and I am chairing the meeting this evening. Can I just ask everyone present in the meeting to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off or in silent mode for the duration of the meeting, and that this meeting is being broadcast live on the Council's YouTube channel, and a copy of the recording will be available on the channel shortly after the meeting finishes. Members and officers on the meeting are reminded to keep their microphones on mute unless they're called to speak. Members can indicate that they wish to speak by typing their name into the chat function. Please do not use the chat function to ask questions of officers or councillors, because they will not be answered as the chat stream cannot be seen by the public broadcast. So I will ask each of the members of this committee to say good evening in a moment. We also have a number of officers present who have turned their camera off, and they will come into it when answering questions. I'll introduce the councillors. If you could please indicate your presence. Vice Chair, Councillor Mark Bainan.
Good evening, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Rowena Bass.
Good evening, Chair.
Councillor Alison Holt.
Good evening, Chair.
And Councillor Jürgen Jürgenathan.
Good evening, Chair.
Thank you all. The officers I will ask to introduce themselves when they wish to speak on an item to give information or answer questions. But I'd particularly like to welcome Mr. Ian. Oh, I apologise, I've forgotten the other member of the committee. How important is that? The independent member of the committee, Mr. Paul Eardley.
Hi, everyone. Good evening.
And we also have from Grant Thornton, our external auditors, Mr. Ian Murray. Welcome.
Evening, Chair.
Fiona, are there any apologies or attendance of substitutions?
No, Chair.
Thank you. Do any members have any declarations of interest, disclosable pecuniary interests or other non-pecuniary interests, i.e. personal interests, relevant to items on this agenda? If any members have any declarations of interest, please indicate using the chat function now and I will call you to speak. No members are indicating any declarations of interest. There was a slight error on the agenda as published, which said that we were approving the minutes of the meeting on the 24th of July. It should have read the 24th of October 2019. For those who were present at that meeting, can we agree those minutes as correct record?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. I will sign those at a convenient moment. I think that will be sometime in the future, possibly. So we'll now move on to the first item on the agenda, the External Audit and Pension Fund Plan. And I'd like to introduce Ian Murray of Grant Thornton to introduce the item.
Thank you, Chair. The plan in front of committee this evening is, as you said, is the plan for both the county council, the council's audit, but also the audit of the pension fund. In past years, we've done these as separate items, but we've tried to save some trees and now consolidate these into one item. Some of this will be familiar to the committee, and some of this will be new. I'll take the papers as read, and I think the key highlights for me.
Sorry to interrupt, Ian. Is it possible for you to turn your camera on? I'm not seeing you. You're just a flat eye. That's better. Thank you.
I can do, yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that it's an interesting environment in which to be carrying out audit at the moment, and not least because we're obviously having to do things differently to the way that we have done in the past. And also to say that the kind of, I suppose, the peak of the COVID pandemic happened just as we were in the process of carrying out our planning for, or finalising our planning for the year. So what members have in front of them is a plan which captures our assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our audit of both the council and the pension fund. Members are probably aware we have two responsibilities. We issue a true and fair opinion on the financial statements of both sets of accounts, and then in the public sector we have additional responsibilities in terms of what's called our value for money conclusion, and that's looking at arrangements in place at the council to secure value for money. So looking at the first area of our responsibility is looking at the significant risks to the audit of the financial statement. Those are on pages A26 of your packs, which is section 4 of our report. The first two here are risks which are in every external audit, because they're there as a result of our auditing standards, our professional standards, and they're about revenue recognition. Although we are able to rebut that at most of our local authorities, because your income is broadly fixed, grant, council tax, business rates, those sorts of things. And where you do have revenue which is demand-led, on the whole, users are paying in advance of receipt of the service. So things like leisure, library fines, those planning applications, those sorts of things. The second one there is around management override of controls, and that's looking for basically gearing our audit up to make sure that we give ourselves a chance of detecting any material fraud that might be there in terms of management overriding controls to either commit fraud or to present a more favourable outcome in the financial statements. The other areas then probably familiar in some instances, and really deal with the underlying uncertainty that's in any set of accounts. And there's two areas of focus there for us in terms of the council's accounts around the valuation of land and buildings, and also the valuation of the pension fund liability. And we focus on those because management is having to exercise judgment in deriving those numbers, and is also using experts in the form of the valuer for the land and buildings, and then an actuary for the pension fund liability. And in terms of the pension fund accounts, the same is true. I've got these set out on page A30, and that's looking at the valuation of investments in the fund, where again there's some judgment which is being exercised by management in terms of deriving those numbers. Things have been further complicated this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's sort of twofold from our perspective. So first of all, councils have had a capacity challenge in terms of administering and dealing with the pandemic, and obviously producing financial statements. So we're interested from the perspective of how the accounts have been pulled together, the control environment, that side of things, and whether things have changed. And we'll come on to talk about a few of the changes as a result of the pandemic in a moment. And then the other is just the general uncertainty that the pandemic creates, particularly with it hitting its peak at the balance sheet date at the end of March. And obviously, as accountants and auditors, we don't like uncertainty, and it just makes things more difficult to both produce estimates and then to audit them. We're seeing that particularly impacts on those key valuations. So on the valuation of land and buildings, and on the valuation of particularly more complex financial instruments in the pension fund and in the council's accounts. I think in terms of the accounts, the only other thing I probably just wanted to bring to members' attention is materiality. And so the materiality for both audits is set out on page A33 of your packs, and that's what we use to both assess kind of the tolerable error that we can within the accounts, but it's also used to drive our work in terms of those balances that we test and those balances that we scope out of the accounts. In terms of the value for money arrangements, we've focused on two risks, which again hopefully will be familiar to members, and this is really looking at the sort of the underlying financial resilience and the arrangements in place at the council for both managing and setting budgets in the short to medium term. And again, the COVID pandemic has a significant impact here, not just in terms of short-term pressures and short-term costs that local government have had to incur and absorb, with some uncertainty about exactly how much of that will be funded from central government. But I think more importantly, it's about the impact, the uncertainty that creates in the medium to longer term around particularly things like council tax receipts, business rates. And going into the pandemic, we were still waiting for a spending review, and there was still there were a lot of moving parts, and you need quite a good crystal ball to try and work out exactly where various bits were going to land. And unfortunately, events over the last 4 to 5 months aren't going to help that in terms of adding delay to the spending review when it comes, but also putting pressure on services and on some of those key funding streams as the council moves into the medium to long term. So that will be the area of focus for us in terms of our value for money conclusion. I think just finally, I should say something about fees, because I think it's the obvious question that one of you will ask, and those are set out on page 15 of the report, A36 in your packs. So last year we came back to our clients after the event and asked for fee increases, and those fee increases have been driven broadly by scope change for us as external auditors. When the tender for the public sector audit appointments was released in 2016, the quality ask or the expectation of providers was that all audits would be achieving a kind of a 2B or above. So that was sort of considered a pass in that environment. Given the scrutiny that external audit is under as a profession, and recent reviews from the Financial Reporting Council, that expectation has increased now, and the expectation is that all of our audits will achieve a 2A, which is so that you can score a 1, which is good, a 2A, which is good with few improvements needed. So that they've increased the ask for us, and particularly in areas where we're auditing estimates, such as the property valuation and the pension fund liability. And unfortunately, that creates more work for us. And whilst firms have tried to absorb some of that cost, it's just not feasible for us to do that and not put audit quality at risk. And so this year, rather than coming back with a nasty surprise after the event, we're seeking to share what our proposed fee variations are with clients up front, albeit it's still subject to the same approval process. So it's still ultimately for PSAA Limited to agree what the fee for the council and the pension fund audit will be. I wasn't proposing to say very much more, but happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Ian. If members of the committee can indicate in the chat function if they wish to ask questions or make comments. And in the meantime, are there any officers that want to add anything to what Ian has said? You can just jump in if you wish.
Yeah, so nothing.
You want to introduce yourself for the live stream?
Of course. I'm Rachel Howard, Acting Assistant Director for Finance. So nothing particular to add to what Ian has said, but just happy to take any questions from the officer side if that's helpful.
Thank you, Rachel. So first I have Rowena, Councillor Bass.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have a couple of questions and then you can decide who to put them to best. So on the auditor's plans that identify certain risks, I might have missed it, but I didn't see the DSG overspend on there as a significant risk and the effect on reserves. So if either the officers or the auditors could answer that. And then my other question is on the pension fund. So I understand, I don't sit on the pension committee anymore, but I understand that the actuarial valuation was quite recent. And I just wondered what the requirements were on whether there has to be a kind of revised valuation given, you know, the significant events of COVID, and whether that would have changed it. So that's my two questions.
Thank you. Ian, are you happy to answer those?
So, yeah, so I can from an audit perspective, and if there's anything Rachel feels she wants to add from officers, then so if we deal with the DSG deficit first, so we are in discussion with officers at the moment about the DSG deficit, and we have been for a number of years. It has an impact in two ways from my perspective. So there's, first of all, there's how you account for it. So there's how you reflect it in the financial statements. So and SITFA have issued some guidance, and there is a piece of legislation, and they are helpful, but they don't totally resolve the ambiguity from for the financial year for 1920. And so our take is that really that deficit needs to sit against usable reserves, or usable reserves. So it acts as a negative in terms of the sort of the overall reserve position that the council is reflecting. And in fairness, that's how the council has presented it in the past. We're talking with officers at the moment about how they might just tweak that presentation in the financial statements this year to make things so that we can steer a course through that ambiguity without having to take any drastic, unnecessarily drastic action. It's probably the best way to put it at the moment. And so that's not trying to obfuscate it. That's just trying to I think the council have been very transparent about how that's been presented in the accounts historically, and we just need to. Sometimes, unfortunately, accounting and auditing standards don't allow you to apply common sense, and so we're trying to come up with something which will allow us to maintain some of that transparency, but also not fall foul of any of those other requirements. So there's the accounting for it. And then the real impact, I think, from my point of view, is around that financial resilience piece. And being completely frank, we're going to take a pessimistic view. We're going to be asking the council to think about what's the worst case scenario, because if things were challenging for local government coming into the COVID pandemic, they're certainly not getting any easier as a result of it. So we will. Those would be, those are the questions, the types of conversations we've already started to have, and we'll continue to have around the DSG deficit. And I appreciate that there is an ongoing discussion between the council and central government about who ultimately funds the deficit position. What no one can disagree with is that deficit position needs to be funded. So that's broadly speaking how we'll approach that one. I don't know whether Rachel wants to come in on the DSG before I move to the pension side. Or...
Yeah, happy to come in. So I think Ian's covered the main points. I think the key issues are ensuring that we account for it correctly and come to a sensible agreement that is reflective of reality and in line with accounting standards, and that Ian and his team are happy to sign off. And I'm confident we will get there with that. As Ian said, the big risk is around the value for money conclusion, and we've always known that the DSG position is a significant risk for us. Obviously, with the COVID situation, our financial position has become more challenging than it was without that, and so we'll have to consider those things in the round as we do throughout.
And then I think the second question Councillor Bass was about the impact of COVID-19 on the valuation of the pension fund. So it will have an impact potentially around the value of some of the assets in the fund at the balance sheet date, and actually, fortunately, some of the financial instruments in the fund in Kingston aren't as complicated as some of the ones we see elsewhere. So that's helpful. So there is some uncertainty there. And I won't speak for actuaries, but I suspect what they would say is that when they value the fund, they're taking a very long-term view. So additional contributions, for example, they're taking a kind of they're looking at a 25-year duration of the liability. So they're looking a long way into the future. So when they're valuing the fund now in terms of setting contribution rates, additional contributions, the funding position, I think it's not that they're ignoring it, but they're less concerned about the impact of the pandemic, because they're used to the economy kind of operating in that cycle, and they're taking a longer term view than the impact, hopefully, of the pandemic itself.
Thank you. Happy with? Oh, sorry, Rachel. Do you want to?
I was going to say thank you for those very long responses, but yeah. So I assume what it's saying is you don't have to revise the actuarial valuation.
I was just going to add on that point. So I think the actuarial valuation date was 31st of March 2019 rather than 2020. Just the valuation process takes quite a long period of time. So it's substantial time after that valuation date at which we receive all the information and final figures. So there's probably far less impact it being then in the cycle than if the 3-year valuation had been a year later.
It may not have taken place if it had been a year later, by the end of March. I next have Paul with some questions.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that, I think it's Rena, that's a really good question. So why would the valuations not be a significant risk in the pension fund? I know there's the things that we've just spoken about there, but on the current document that we're seeing, I would have wondered, should it be flagged as a significant risk, just to pinpoint to people that read the document, and also when we come back and look at the account that's been thought of, and maybe the previous answer answers that. But obviously with negative cash outgoings, I'm surprised, given all the uncertainty in some of the estimates, you would probably need to do something there to mitigate that risk. And I don't know, I'm not the auditors, but should we be classifying that as a significant risk in the current climate? That's my first one. Do you want to answer that one, Ian? It looks like you had an answer.
So I think if the fund had level, say, so when you're looking at financial, there are three hierarchies basically in terms of how the estimate's derived, with one being just, for example, a listed instrument. So you could go to an exchange and you could say, right, that the price at this date is this, and it's fairly easy to work out what the value of that is. Then you have level 2, where you don't have the kind of the direct reference point, but you have enough observable. There's enough similar sorts of investment or similar sorts of vehicle that you can go and you can make a decent stab at what the valuation would be. And you have level 3, where you're looking at kind of what's called significant unobservable inputs. So that might be, for example, that you're holding equity in a company that's not listed and is very niche, and you just, you don't necessarily have, you need a lot of expertise in terms of how to value it. The fund doesn't hold any level 3 investments. So if I was looking at a fund which was holding significant amounts of level 3 investments, this would definitely be it is in all of my funds where I've got that. It is a level. We are flagging it as a significant risk, and that's not to say that we're not going to do work around the uncertainty that is there in those level 2 investments. It's just that because they are by their nature easier to derive the values, the uncertainty has less of an impact. So I think part of it is just driven by the makeup of the assets that happen to be in this particular fund.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. So I've got a few others, and tell me obviously when to stop if I'm keep going on. Your team obviously has a little bit of is there a gap in knowledge, maybe fair to say, because the senior manager, I think, has gone from the team. So is it a manager straight into you, given all the uncertainty where the council is? How do we mitigate that risk, just from, I guess, the councillor's perspective and Lizzie's perspective in signing the accounts? So I just wonder if there's some things that you could just explain, how you've brought the rest of the team up to speed, shared that knowledge, your presence in the audit, that type of stuff as well.
So Paul has moved on from this audit, but has not moved on from the firm. So he's still around, and so the kind of our knowledge of the council hasn't left the firm and is still there. Keith has been involved in the audit for a number of years, so that, there has been a succession plan in place for a number of years. So Keith is stepping up into shoes, part of which he's already been doing a lot of that manager role for a number of years. Being completely honest, we've been in a slight rebuild phase, but we have been able to recruit below Keith. And I think in prior years, one of the challenges we've had, being honest, has been at the kind of qualified but not manager level. And on this year's audit, I've got 3 qualified assistant managers, one way or another, supporting Keith, which just hasn't been there in the past. So while some of them are learning the intricacies and of local government accounting, actually in terms of the sort of the financial statements audit, the quality of the team, I think, is possibly stronger than it's been for a little while. And Keith is whilst he's not necessarily been as visible to you guys, he's certainly done an awful lot of the work behind the scenes the last 2 years, and knows the council as well as Paul and I do. So
cool, excellent. And obviously the housing benefit claim, if I read this right, and obviously we've missed a few committees, wasn't quite as it should have been last year. There was a qualification to that. Is that right? As I read that, does that my interpretation of that right? So I guess my question is, we don't need to go back over old ground. What work is either internal audit, the finance team at the council, and or yourselves done to make sure, I guess, we're in a position whereby we have adequate controls, we're not going to get there again, and there's a robust control environment there?
I'll let officers speak for themselves, but I would just like to provide some context around this piece of work in particular. So this isn't so this is work that we do on behalf of the Department for Work and Pensions, and it's more like an agreed upon procedures type. So it's not a full audit. It's work that we do, and it's very heavily prescribed in terms of how we do the work and how we treat the findings. And I think if we were to, and I haven't got it in front of me, but I think if we were to look at the, I'm happy to provide this to members if it's of use. If we were to look at the nature of the findings, some of these things can be they're very minor things. They can be just someone miskeying an error, miskeying something into a system, somebody just missing a piece of information, and they automatically, almost the moment you find something, you move into qualification because of the heavily prescribed nature of what it is that you do and how we do it. And I would say that in my experience, these claims get certified with qualification more often than they don't. So I think there's a kind of a law of I suppose there is a law of diminishing returns here in terms of trying to kind of get to a spurious level of accuracy, or in terms of you're processing vast amounts of data, vast amounts of information through your benefits function. It's sort of inevitable sometimes that things get wrong, and they haven't had any impact, I don't think, in terms of the amount of subsidy that the councils ultimately receive from DWP. So, but I'll let officers add their tuppence worth as well.
Rachel, do you want to come in first, and then Alex has got something to add?
So I'm not going to be able to answer in details. I'm not as familiar with the details of that piece of audit work, but I'm happy to go away and look at it. I think the point Ian makes is valid in that I think in previous years when we've had a not qualified opinion on that piece of work, I think it was noted as it being quite rare rather than nothing of note. So I'm happy to go away and look at that, and I think Alex was going to comment from internal audit.
Thank you, Chair. I'm obviously Alex. I'm the head of the South West London Audit Partnership. We, as you know, we don't do work on the grant claim itself, but we do work on the control side as part of the internal audit plan. It's one of our key financial audits, but we don't do all of our key financial audits on an annual basis. So we didn't actually do any work on housing benefits last year. It was, however, completed in 2018-19 and given substantial assurance. So there's no significant issues around the control environment identified as part of that review.
Thank you, Alex. And if we need to, we can pick that up when we come to your reports later. Paul, you had more questions, I think.
Sorry, I will stop. Obviously, estimates in the current climate is quite a difficult thing in general to do, isn't it? So I wonder if there's a few examples based on some of the literature you put in the, the Bryden report, Redmond report, National Audit Office, some of your findings from your recent regulatory reviews that you can maybe bring to the councillors' attention on how robust those how robust the work you would do over those estimates and how it maybe have changed from last year to this year, particularly in the COVID-19 situation and the situation the council faces itself as well.
That's quite a lot.
So maybe pick an example. Maybe pick.
So I think let's talk. If we talked about property valuations is the one that I suspect when we come to present the findings report we'll be talking to you about, and I can almost tell you now that there'll be an emphasis of matter in my audit report around property valuations, and that's not a qualification. That's drawing the user of the accounts to the to attention to the fact that that at year end there is so RICS, the surveying the surveying regulator, they've issued guidance to their members effectively saying they need to consider a material uncertainty in valuations issued around the 31st of March, and that's because valuers need a certain amount of data to be taking, or a certain amount of transactions, a certain amount of activity to be taking place in the market to be able to get the data that they need to derive values, and that just didn't happen. And so the absence of that means that it's just very difficult for them to have to reduce that uncertainty to an acceptable level. So I think without exception, most local authorities who have got significant property significant land and buildings, which is most local authorities, will end up with a similar emphasis of matter in their audit report. So that's the example. And I suppose the difference would be that I think it's just the skepticism. I think it's just the level of follow-up and question and challenge that we now do compared to what we would have done maybe 2 years ago. So in the past, we may have said, well, it's a number that's been produced by an expert. They're a qualified surveyor. I'm not, and therefore I'm going to a certain extent, take at face value what they're telling me. And now I put to the one side the fact that I'm not a surveyor, but we go back and we ask the questions about what's the valuation basis, what are the key inputs, what are the key assumptions, how we agree those where we can to evidence, and we understand we have a much better understanding of what drives those numbers coming into the accounts and whether they're reasonable or not. So I think it's that kind of, it's the professional skepticism, and it's probably just Rachel may have a take. We just ask more questions and we come back again and again in a way that we probably wouldn't have done 2 or 3 years ago. And unfortunately, that takes time. It takes time for us and it takes time for officers. But the upside is that when we're signing opinions, I think the quality of the assurances we're giving is much better. In terms of Bryden and Redmond, well, so I suppose Bryden is pointing, the main thing really that's coming from is kind of, it's just questioning what an audit does. And I think there is a big expectation gap between what auditors do or have done and what auditors should do in terms of providing assurance to stakeholders. And Redmond, we don't know when it's going to report because it's already slightly delayed. Redmond is looking much more at the question from a local authority perspective, and sort of two questions, which is, first of all, are local authority financial statements fit for purpose? Because if they're ostensibly about telling the public how the council has spent its money, they probably don't do that job very well, in my opinion. And then following on from that, our auditors, our public sector auditors, focused on the things that really matter. So should I be worrying about, should I be more concerned about how you valued your property, for example, or should I be more worried about the underlying financial resilience of the council, and where should local audit better, is better focused to add more value to its stakeholders, acknowledging that those stakeholders are slightly different from what they would be in a if you were auditing a commercial or privately owned entity.
Just one very final question. I promise I'll stop. You were right. I was probably going to ask about the audit fee, but I've got a supplementary question to ask. I wonder if it's just worth closing that off at a later meeting to say this is what the expectation of the increase was about, and then this is what we delivered, just to dot all the I's and cross the T's. It just has to be a simple memo. You probably do it anyway, but I think that makes it.
Yeah, we'll come back to the fee in the findings report, and then again in the audit letter. So yeah, cool. We'll come back through members at least twice.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Alison, you had some questions.
Yeah, I've got some questions as well. I don't know if you want to take them one by one, just like you did before. I was kind of following on from the Councillor Bass on the pension scheme, and certainly I'm looking at the impact on the financial statements. Was also to the liability situation with regard to the McLeod situation, which is, there's been some updates recently, and I just wondered if that's something that it's not included in the papers, but I just wondered if that's something that you would think should be added in as well.
So it's not included in the papers, but we will pick that up. We'll pick that up through the work that we'll look at. We look at, again, what are the assumptions the actuary has made, and McLeod will be one of the questions that we seek to answer as we go through that process. I think the difficulty with McLeod is that there's still quite a lot of uncertainty. So we know things have moved on, but until you get to a point where you have a remedy and you know exactly what that remedy is, there's always going to be a bit of guesswork involved in terms of how you quantify the impact of that. And being completely frank, the actuaries in the market all take a slightly different stance, because they're all making slightly different assumptions, and we saw that last year, and we're seeing that again this year. So it's not. I think it's not that it doesn't have as much relevance. It's just that because the biggest chunk of the impact was last year with the past service cost, and we are still seeing it have an impact in terms of the work that actuaries are doing. It's just that it's maybe less stark than it was when we were looking at this 12 months ago, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's fine. The other thing is about audit deliverables. You haven't put in timings for. I know you've been allowed to delay the reporting and the production of accounts, but you haven't put it still to be confirmed. Is that meaning that it won't be within the timescales that we'd expect, or have you?
Well, so normally this meeting would be the one where we'd be presenting a findings report and we'd be looking to approve accounts. And as at today, we don't have draft accounts as yet. So that's why we've so until we know when we're going to get the accounts, I can't. It's difficult for me to know when to. I can't commit a team without a set of accounts. So until we know that bit, we don't really know when we'll start, and so we don't really know when we'll finish.
Okay. Rachel, come in there. That helps. Yeah, so as you're aware, the deadlines for submitting accounts were extended as a result of COVID. We have up until the 31st of August rather than 31st of May to submit our draft accounts. We are very nearly there. I'm hoping Ian's team will have them in the next few days. I did say that to Ian about a week ago as well. But yeah, final touches, and it should be with the auditors in the next few days, and draft accounts will be published on the website when they are as well.
Thank you. Just before you carry on, Alison, on that, could you update all members of the committee when the draft accounts have been sent over to Grant Thornton, and maybe Ian, you can then, when you've had a chance to work out what those timescales will be, send something round to all of the members of the committee as sort of post-meeting notes, if you like, to fill in those TBCs, and Fiona will be able to help you to be able to do that.
That's absolutely happy to do that, and I suppose we'll need to work with the committee, because we'll need to come back. Obviously, we need to come back through the committee with findings in the final version of the accounts.
And we can do that. It's just as soon as you know when you're going to have completed the work.
We will.
Given everything, let us know, and then we'll work together on to get a date. Yeah.
So, and I think the only thing it's a year with very many moving parts, is all I would say.
That's fine. That's why I'm suggesting it just comes back to the committee.
We will do. That's
and when you're able to make it public, we can help you publicise that. But if you're not able to do that straight away, it just gives the committee members an indication of those dates as you anticipate them at the moment, at least. Sorry, Alison, do carry on with your questions.
So it was on the committee papers, it's A34, and on your value for money, it's page 16. It was just that it says the position has been updated and you are now proposing a balanced budget for 2021. And given the recent MHCLG returns, which have been highlighting something quite different, I'm just wondering if that is obviously a significant concern for the council. We did have a balanced, we brought forward a balanced budget, but now these returns are showing a significant deficit, and so it's just really whether you need to reflect that and how it's going to have an impact, certainly on the savings plans that we had, and also the income that we were due to receive. So just wondering if that's is still a valid thing.
So I think that in updating this so we had a pre-COVID version, and then we've had various iterations. I think that sentence probably should have come out, in fairness. As you'll appreciate, we're trying to hit a moving target, just in the way that you are with some of this. So yes, so we appreciate that that the council, based certainly on our recent conversations, we know that there will be that you're going to have to work hard to make sure that you do balance the position in 2021 and beyond. So apologies, that one probably should have come out.
Okay. And the final bit was just coming back on the high needs block deficit, on the school's budget. You said that you're going to be pessimistic in the worst case, sort of worst case scenario, and I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what that means.
Well, so I suppose at the moment the DFE seems to be the legislation that the DFE, the new early years regulations would suggest that the DFE is anticipating that that deficits will be made good within a 3-year window. So I suppose if that's a reasonable assumption, the question we would be asking the council is, worst case scenario, and the DFE isn't going to fund this gap, and you had to in 3 years, how would you do it, and what would that look like? Okay,
which would be extremely challenging, given
extremely challenging. I mean, I'm not. But I think this is the difficulty for you, and a difficulty. You're in a difficult position, and it puts us in a difficult position. Obviously, in terms of assessing the kind of the sustainability, or the financial underlying financial resilience of the council, and I suppose I understand absolutely the context, and I understand the politics of it too, but I've got to make sure that in carrying out my responsibilities, I'm properly kicking the tires, I suppose, for want of a better phrase.
Okay, thank you. That's my final question. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I'm not seeing any of the other members wanting to come in with any questions. Last chance to do so, or comments. In which case I'll move the recommendations at the front of the report, which is essentially that we resolve the commentary set out in the External Auditor's Progress Report attached to Annex 1 be noted, in particular the Housing Benefit Subsidy Certification set out on page 5 of the Progress Report. And it does say in consideration given as to whether there are any comments or matters arising from it that should be brought to the attention of the Response and Recovery Committee. I haven't heard any comments that should be brought to the attention of the R&R Committee, so I'm taking that there are none.
Liz?
Yes.
Sorry, Chair. Do you not think that the comments on the DSG grant should go through to the R&R?
I mean, my personal opinion, I mean...
Seems significant what the auditor was saying.
Draw to the personal attention of some of the members of the administration, the comments on that. However, I'm not sure it's needing a report to go through to the actual formal committee. And I think there's a difference between ensuring that some of the portfolio holders and the leader look at that information that's been given. Excuse me.
Okay, perhaps it's the stage, and then it will be what's reported, because this is the planning stage of the audit, and then perhaps it's better to see what comes out of the actual audit. Okay, yeah, I agree.
I do agree. I think that depending upon what they comes in the final report that comes back to us, whenever that is, sometime in the autumn, it may well be then that it needs to go through. But I think at the moment there's nothing. From my mind, obviously, if members want to vote on something going forward to the R&R committee, we can do so.
No, thanks for that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rowena. And the second part is the recommendation is that the commentary set out in the external audit plan attached to Annex 2 be noted, and again with consideration of any comments going forward to the Response and Recovery Committee. And again, I'm not seeing anything that needs to go forward, any matters arising. So I move those recommendations. Do I have a seconder?
Liz, you've got a couple of comments on the chat.
Thank you very much for pointing that out, Rowena. So Alison.
It was just following up on the fact that it would be reported to the Recovery and Response and Recovery Committee. Where would it normally go to?
I think in normal circumstances, it would have gone to the relevant strategic committee had there been anything to report in. I think that there isn't anything from these reports, as Councillor Bass has stated, depending on what comes back to us, there may well be the need for something around the DSG or the value for money qualification, the value for money statement and the governance statement that may need to go back. I think it would have gone to the normal strategic committee, and by then it may well be, well, I hope we will be back in the normal strategic committee cycles by the time this comes back to us. Certainly that would be the plan, because our next one is in October, I believe. Paul, you also had a very quick question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Ian and Rachel. I think you're operating in incredibly difficult times, and it's very easy here to read a paper and criticise and ask questions, and hopefully it's constructive and the challenge piece. And I just want to wish you good luck for the next few months, because I know how incredibly hard it is with all the scrutiny, both from us, the external regulator, and just to say thank you, because sometimes that's somewhat missing. So just good luck, and I hope you get there in the next few months.
Thank you, Paul, and I should have done that. So thank you for the reminder, but thank you to everyone that's working on that. So I've moved the recommendation. Do I have a seconder?
I can second that. And I'd just like to echo, Paul's comments. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah. Totally agree.
Chair,
you're muted, Liz.
Sorry. Oh, my microphone. I apologise. I will take the recommendations as unanimous unless any colleague indicates that they wish to have a vote on it. Does any colleague wish to have a vote? I can see shaking of heads. So therefore, we will take it as a unanimous agreement of those recommendations. Thank you very much, Ian, for joining us this evening and presenting and answering our questions particularly. We'll now move on to item 3, which is the second report, which is the internal audit report, the annual internal audit report. And I'd like to ask Alex Wilson to introduce the item, please.
Thank you, Chair. The annual internal audit report is something that we're required to do, obviously on an annual basis. And I'm required as the head of audit for Kingston to provide an annual assurance on the council's control environment, which is included with this report. And that feeds into the annual governance statement, which you would normally see, obviously, at this committee, but that will be delayed to a later committee when the statutory accounts come back to be approved. Just some key points for members to note. We were commissioned to deliver 697 days in 1920, and we over-delivered on this, but we did contain this within our budget envelope, and we were still also able to deliver a small saving for Kingston Council as part of the shared audit service. The plan that went to the March committee in 2019 included 78 days more than we had the resources to deliver. So by that I mean that the shared service board and Kingston commissioned the 697 days, and the audit plan that went to committee for approval had more days on than we could actually deliver. So at the meeting I stressed very clearly that we would only be able to deliver the commission number of days. And the reason why we had more was because following our assessment of risk and the discussions with the departmental management teams, we had more audits on there that officers and ourselves were looking hopefully to do during the year based on the risks. But as is the norm, the audit plan is flexible and risks change during the year, and we knew that some of those would naturally fall off the plan or move into the following year. As changes, the new risks arose and risks changed. So you'll see from the report at 1.7 that the plan that was approved included 40 audits. It should have actually said 48, with a further 29 for Achieving for Children. During the year, 2 of these audits were cancelled, 6 audits were added, and 17 were moved into 2021. Obviously, that's a lot more than we would normally have, but in part reflects the fact that we had too many audit days in the plan in the first instance. Obviously, some of these we've moved into the following year. But as a result of COVID, and as I'll explain in my later agenda item on the audit plan, it's likely that some of these won't be done either. So although we only delivered 71% of the numbers of audits, as I say, these were based on the 48 audits, and we knew we wouldn't deliver all of these. We also undertook quite significant audits of a couple of areas of risk, so on mental health and in debt recovery. So we spent more time on these audits than we'd originally envisaged, but I think that reflected the risks at the time. So we think that was appropriate for us to do that. And as I said, the audit plan, it's really important that it's flexible and it flexes to reflect the council's key risks. So we would expect there to be some fluidity in that plan during the year. Obviously, as a pandemic hit towards the end of the year, that impacted on the audit work that we were doing. So we temporarily we suspended our audit plan for 2021, and we closed down the audits for 1920. We were in a very fortunate position in so much as we had delivered most of the audit plan sort of quite early in Q4, so it didn't impact significantly on our audit work. And as I say, we were able to over deliver on the number of days by the end of the year in any event. But it did mean there were a couple of audits that we closed down before we completed all the work, and one of those was accounts receivable. So we did some work around the just looking at the control environment, but what we didn't do was some detailed testing, and we'll pick that up this year. In terms of my annual audit opinion, I've given an adequate opinion over the council's control environment this year. This is at 1.17 in the report. As I do every year, I caveat that against the areas of significant risk and the issues that I've identified during the year. So by that I mean any limited audit assurance reports and priority 1 recommendations we've raised in the year. These are listed at 2.8 in the report and summarised in more detail at 2.10 to 2.27. I don't plan to go through each of those individually, but I'm obviously happy to take questions on them. I've also got with me tonight Jill Payne, one of my colleagues, and also Dawn Secker from Adults, who can assist on answering any questions, obviously, in the adult social care areas, should you have any. So happy to open it up to questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can members of the committee indicate in the chat function if they wish to ask questions or have comments? In the meantime, does Jill or Dawn have anything to add to what Alex has said? No, I'll take that as a no unless they're asked a question. First of all, I have Rowena, Councillor Bass.
Hi. Yeah, Alex, thanks for all the work that you do, especially in difficult circumstances. I don't know how auditors, external or internal, certainly very quickly adapted to a new way of working. So my question may be related to this, or it may be more towards a future plan, but I'll ask it and you can either answer it now or it might be relevant. So obviously, so we're looking at what's been done, but it might be partly in that. And I think one of the new emerging risks is all this cybersecurity risks, in which council systems are obviously vulnerable as well. And I just wondered if you'd done any work on looking at cybersecurity resilience in the past year, or what you were planning to do, because it does seem to be one of the major emerging risks.
Thank you, Councillor Bass. Yes, you're absolutely right, and it was one of the areas that we, alongside probably every other local authority that we work closely with, have acknowledged as a significant risk. So what we've done already this year is we've undertaken an IT audit needs assessment for Kingston, and we've had discussions with the head of IT about what the key risks are and where we want to concentrate our audit resources on the IT side. Obviously, cyber security, disaster recovery, business continuity are all key areas of risk, and all of those will be covered this year within the audit plan. So they won't be done in quarters 1 and 2, as you'll see from the audit plan that's come to this committee tonight. But they will it's certain that will be included within the quarter 3 audit plan that will come back to this committee.
Thanks, and I can tell from your response that it is a risk that's being taken seriously, so thank you, that's reassuring.
Thank you, Rowena. Next to get into the chat function, Alison.
Okay, so a couple of things. It was just to not been involved in this committee before, so I just wanted to ask, just to give me an explanation as to what kind of why something would get cancelled. You don't need to give me the ones that were cancelled, but I just wondered why something would be cancelled rather than carried forward in terms of the audits you were planning.
So sometimes it's because, for example, where a piece of audit work is added and it perhaps it's a wide area. So, for example, we ended up doing a lot of work around housing income, where we'd already got a piece of work in the plan around income collection, and because we'd spent so much time on that and a number of other audits within the kind of income area, we decided we got enough assurance for the year on that, and that we would take that out this year. So it's sometimes to do with the fact that the risks have changed and they're no longer relevant, or that we've got assurance from doing other pieces of work, or indeed assurance from other sources. So it might be assurance from Ofsted or other external agencies, which mean we don't need to do that audit work anymore.
Okay, that is assuring. So my other question was about the adult social care, the debt recovery, and I was just wondered. Well, I know you're going to report back on that, but I just wondered when the work was carried out, and whether there was bad debt provisions against it or not.
I think I've probably asked Jill to come in on this one, Jill Payne, if possible.
I think that the audit took about 6 months to do. I think it started in September 2019.
So in terms of the debt provision, one of the issues that we got was the fact that we weren't sufficiently writing off our debts. So we weren't reviewing, we weren't following up on the debts as we should have been. We weren't reviewing them properly. We weren't identifying the ones and reviewing them and chasing them for where they were old debts and potentially where they could be statutorily barred, so therefore that we couldn't collect them. But we weren't writing them off either. So I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I can find out, Councillor Holt, as to whether we put any provision in the accounts for any of the bad debt, but perhaps Rachel might know.
Yeah, happy to come in there. Yeah, absolutely. So all debt across the board would be considered as part of our bad debt provision calculation. So yes, there would be a relevant bad debt provision made.
Okay, thank you very much. That answered that question. That's me finished.
Excellent. Just while we're on that, I wondered if it's worth Dawn coming in we will get a progress report at the next meeting on how, obviously these are a substantial number of priority 1 recommendations. Just wonder whether it's worth Dawn coming in to talk through some of the issues that we've had that have led to this, which are covered briefly in the paper, but you could bring those out a little bit more, if that's okay, Dawn.
Of course I can. Just to sound Dawn Secker, the Interim Assistant Director for Adult Social Care. Yes, I think it's been a challenge for us, and I think there have been a number of reasons why we're in the situation we're in. It's been a very fragmented system, and as you've seen from the report, I think it indicates some of the major reasons why it's been difficult to get any traction on that debt. We have had some successes, I have to say, on some of the debt that we've had, but we still have large amount of debt. Some of it has been about staffing in particular areas, and I think that has been a real challenge, particularly in finance and legal, in terms of having the staff to be able to progress those cases. Some of it has been about recording systems and different systems. So it's amazing how many different systems we use as a council, and I think actually audit is really helpful to help us look at that and streamline it so that we can have much more visibility and transparency about where that debt is and how we progress it. That's been part of it. I think we've also struggled with probably reviewing those cases because we've had a large number of cases. I think prioritising them, meeting together, getting that traction and that support, I guess, from different parts of the council. It's not a criticism. I think it's been a difficult job for a lot of people, but I think particularly in terms of writing off debt, we have to be much more proactive, thinking about it and actually taking action, because otherwise we get to a situation where it becomes statute barred. So we have to be much more proactive about what we have done. We do a lot more now with proactive work. in the operational teams. So we try and prevent people getting into debt. So we do a lot more on financial inclusion, and we do a lot more now on trying to support people not to get into those large debts. So quite a lot of the debt that we've got is very historic. And what we're finding now is we're trying to prevent that happening and support people more. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. It just helps to set the context, I think, in a little bit more information than is able to be put into the report by Alex. Paul, you had a couple of questions.
Yeah, can I just follow up, just so I understand the debt piece? So have we provided for the 4.5, and maybe you can't go into the specifics, so please just tell me that you can't do that. But, you know, I mean, if you've got 4.5 million of debt outstanding for 2 years, I assume there's a full provision against that. Is that what you were saying, Rachel? That was one of my questions that Alison had asked, and how does this level of debt compare to other similar like type authorities and that type of stuff? So is there any benchmarking or any lessons learned that the Internal Audit Partnership could share with Kingston?
Shall I come in on that first part? So I couldn't tell you precisely offhand that there's the exact percentage of provision against those specific amounts, but I believe off the top of my head that debt over 2 years old has 100% provision. It's possible it's 90%. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but certainly a high percentage. So so long as that debt's included in our calculation, it should have quite a significant provision against it. But I would have to check the detail of exactly what makes up that figure and exactly what's in the bad debt calculation to be precise.
And Chair, if I can come in on the second part of it, I can't answer for across the 5-borough partnership, although I can answer for one authority. So one of the partners, I undertook an audit of adult social care debt, possibly sort of a year or year and a half ago, and they had exactly the same issues. So I think it's an area that is really difficult because of the type of debt. I think one of the key parts to it is exactly as Dawn said, is being sufficiently resourced to be able to do it, and having parts of the organisation that need to speak to each other also, I think one of the key things is about making sure you are proactive in tackling the debt early, so you don't leave the debts for a number of years, making them much harder to collect in the longer term. So there's certainly lessons to be learned from this, but certainly Kingston aren't on their own in terms of having problems around debt recovery for this type of debt.
Cool. And just one other question on B10, the table. There's some reports that are draft and still to be issued, and there's one or two in the 2018-19 column. So that's Treasury Management, Housing Benefits, Council Tax, and General Ledger. So are they still to be issued, or have they been finalised since the point of writing this report?
Jill, are you able to answer that for me, please?
If they were 18-19, they've all been finalised. I think we've got 2 outstanding audit reports at the moment that are in draft, which is accounts receivable and budget savings. So those are the only ones that are outstanding.
And why would that be 2 outstanding from 18-19?
No, not 18-19. That must be a mistake. There's 2 outstanding from 19-20. I apologise if that's the case.
No, I just worth noting that, because it does look like a few are outstanding when clearly that isn't the case.
No, definitely not.
Yeah. And just one thing, I was a little bit, and I'm not, I'm not familiar with internal audit cycle and how you look at key systems. Is it fair to say that key systems are looked at once every 4 years? When you look at the table, so accounts receivable, accounts payable, council tax, rent, all that type of stuff. Does that tend to be the cycle for most local authorities?
Yes, it is, and the reason for that is that with audit plans reducing quite significantly for most local authorities, it was felt that if we continued to spend the level of resource on key financials on an annual basis, it wouldn't leave us enough to provide assurances on other parts of the organisation. And given that most of the key financial audits were consistently given substantial or full assurance, it was felt it wasn't an appropriate use of resources in any event. Now, going back some years, obviously, it was the requirement from external audit to undertake these reviews every year and to provide external audit with some assurances that they could rely on, but that's no longer the case. So the decision to do a kind of rolling audit plan across a sort of 3 to 4 year timetable was an agreement with external audit on the basis that if we undertook a key financial audit and we found any significant issues and we particularly provided limited assurance, then we would then undertake that audit the following year as well to make sure that any of the key issues have been properly resolved. So that's pretty standard across certainly all the London audit group that I work as part of. We all follow the same process.
Cool. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Paul. I just have a couple of quick questions myself, which is, so obviously when you go in and audit an area and you find substantial problems with it, sorry, I shouldn't use the term substantial, you use it the other way, isn't it? Substantial is good. When you find several priority 1 recommendations, you don't just sort of wait to write the draft report before you talk to the service area about addressing these problems. How does that work? So what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is how would members necessarily know mid-year when you're starting to find these issues in one particular area that you're going to end up in the annual report coming to us, and just trying to see how it might not become just annual, here it is, when hopefully, and I'm sure as Dawn has explained to us, adult social care have been hearing about this from the start of the audit and therefore have already put in place various measures to try and work through these problems that they've got. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at, Alex?
Yes, I do. And so ordinarily in a normal year, unlike this one, we would provide regular update reports to this committee, and that would include quite detailed reports on any of the priority 1 recommendations that we'd raised during the year. So that would provide members with a summary of what the issues were, what the risks were of those particular issues arising, and what action management had agreed to take in order to rectify those issues and mitigate the risks to an acceptable level. So ordinarily you would get that. What you would also get is an update on any follow-up work that we do. So for all the priority 1 recommendations that we raise, we undertake follow-up work to make sure we're satisfied that they're dealt with adequately and in a timely manner. And where that doesn't happen, we report that back to the departmental management teams, to the senior leadership team, and also back to audit committees, so that senior officers and members are cited on the fact that there's some issues that are still not fully rectified. Now, sometimes there's really good reasons for that, and sometimes there isn't. But at least senior officers and members are cited on that, so that they're aware of what the issues are. So you wouldn't just we wouldn't just expect members to wait for a full year to see the results of our labours. You would get regular update reports during the year as part of the normal committee cycle.
Thank you. That shows myself as a novice of this committee, never having sat on it in 18 years as a councillor. So thank you very much for that, Alex. Do any other members have any other questions or comments? No. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for the work that you and the rest of your team do, and thank you for Jill and Dawn for helping answer questions today. I'll now move the recommendations on the front of the report, which for the recording is that we resolve that the report on the activities of internal audit for 1920 is noted, and that the committee will receive an update on progress with priority 1 recommendations with particular reference to the mental health Furcroft and debt recovery ASC, adult social care audits in the autumn. Can I have a seconder?
I can second it.
Thank you very much, Mark. I will take the recommendations as unanimously agreed unless a colleague indicates to the contrary in the chat function or by calling out. Nobody has, so I will take those recommendations as unanimous. Thank you very much. We're now going to do a slight change to the agenda because it makes sense to follow on with the fraud and audit work. So we're going to move Treasury Management down a couple of places, and we're going to switch straight into the update on the fraud work undertaken, which I believe, Kevin Holland, you're going to introduce for us, please. Are you there, Kevin? You're muted and your camera's off, so I can't tell if you're there. Maybe you're expecting Treasury next. Looks like Kevin's either having problems or maybe he's got IT problems. We'll come back to that one, and so we'll move on to the plan, the audit plan, which is item 6. The Internal Audit Charter and Strategy and the Internal Audit Plan for 2021, which again is Alex to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. So the report presents the Internal Audit Charter and Strategy and the rolling Internal Audit Plan for quarters 1 and quarters 2 for this year, which I've sort of already alluded to in my last presentation. So, as required by the Public Sector Internal Audit Standards, we have to have a charter, and this is a formal document which establishes how the internal audit activity sits within the organisation. The strategy is slightly different in that it covers how the service will be developed and delivered, and that includes how we intend to resource the service itself. So, the charter and strategy is Annex 1 to the report. And it's resolved that the committee approves it. However, I just wanted to note that there needs to be a small change to this, which might need to be minuted, and that's to reflect Lauren McCann's revised job title of General Counsel. So at the moment, it's got a previous job title, so I just need to amend that. So apologies for that. In terms of the internal audit plan, this ordinarily would have been presented to committee at the March meeting. Obviously, with the pandemic, etc., that committee meeting didn't take place. But we had already established a risk-based audit plan, which had gone through the normal process of our own internal risk assessment of where we thought the risks were, followed by detailed discussions with senior officers at departmental management teams and with directors to make sure the audit plan reflected where the organisation's key risks were. Obviously, following the pandemic, we haven't scrapped it, but we've put that audit plan to one side because some of those risks are still relevant, but there's other risks that have emerged as a result of COVID that we need to concentrate our attentions on for the time being. So in recognising that COVID has changed priorities somewhat, and many of the services are concentrating on their emergency response, our team, certainly in the first few months, have been utilised across the partnership to help support parts of the business. So by that I mean we've undertaken some work around sort of changes in control processes. We've been advising on things like the processes for some of the discretionary grants and the business rate grants. We've had staff redeployed on taking calls with vulnerable clients and other parts of the business where they've needed additional resource. We've been helping with that. So obviously there's a quite a large part of our Q1 plan that's providing support and advice to Kingston and other partners that we work with. So in line with other local authorities, we've had a lot of discussions across London Audit Group and across our wider networks about how we best ensure that our audit plans are relevant given the current circumstances that we're operating in. And what we've done is we've decided to move to a quarterly rolling audit plan to make sure that the plan is sufficiently fluid and flexible and reflects the organisation's key risks. So the revised Q1 2 plan is attached at Annex 2. We've discussed this with the departmental management teams to make sure we're covering the right areas in terms of what's needed now, and future quarterly meetings with them will help to shape the audit plans going forward. And obviously we'll report the Q3 and Q4 proposed plans back to this committee for your review. Obviously, Chair, when we met last week, I think it was, we talked about whether we can improve the way we develop the audit plan in terms of bringing members' views into the round, because I think it's probably fair to say that when the audit plan comes to audit committee normally in March, that it's almost a fait accompli. And what we probably need to do to make that whole process a bit more robust is to make sure we engage with members before we get to that stage. So we've talked about improving that, haven't we, going forward? And I would certainly support that approach. So Annex 2 includes all the audits that we'll be undertaking for Q1 2. Many of those obviously have already in progress. Annex 2 also includes the audit plan for Achieving for Children. That's already been approved through the AFC Audit and Risk Committee. So I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you. And as before, if you can put your name in the chat. Mark's coming quickly. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Just wondering how I've got a couple of questions, but first one, I guess, is how have you found kind of working and carrying out the audit functions during the pandemic and being in, presumably working remotely, and having your resources, I guess, kind of depleted or spread more widely? Yeah, how has that affected you as a team, do you think?
I think in terms of the remote working, it's worked really well for us, and I think because we work across a 5-borough partnership, we're used to kind of fluidity and flexibility in working remotely anyway. So it's not been a significant change for us like it has for many other parts of the council. So from that perspective, it's been absolutely fine. In many ways, it's almost been easier, although obviously we've been very conscious of the fact that officers are concentrating on dealing with the pandemic and the emerging risks, and we've accepted that there's some parts of our audit plan that we just couldn't legitimately undertake, and that's absolutely fine. But I think we've got really good relationships with the departmental management teams, and so we've had a lot of conversations with them through our quarterly meetings and outside of those about making sure that where we're needed, we're brought in to kind of help in a support sort of advisory capacity, because I think that's really important. What we didn't want to do was disappear off the face of the earth as if internal audit never existed. So I think it's been important that we've been part of that response, if you like, and I think it's been really important for our officers to be there to assist in other areas perhaps we wouldn't ordinarily have got involved in. So I think it's been a really good experience. We felt very much part of the response. And I think one of the really useful bits of work that we've been doing at the moment is the work on looking at the COVID-19 response. So it's a high-level review of the kind of key areas of risk around how the councils responded to the COVID-19 pandemic,
Okay.
and that's been really, really helpful, I think, in just kind of getting that overview of what the authority's done. Actually, we haven't finalised that work, but looking at the results that have come out of it so far, it's very positive in terms of how the councils responded. And what we've done with that is we've done a review across a number of our partners to try and get some comparisons of what others have done. And again, Kingston have come out very favourably in terms of the response, which is really positive, I think.
Yes, thank you. If I come back a couple more questions. Thanks very much, Alex. And yeah, well, that sounds very positive, and yeah, it'd be interesting to see that work when it's available. And also what you said about kind of working together, working kind of cross department, I guess cross council is something that I've heard a lot from officers, and they've it's been a terrible time, and totally, and the rest of it. But there's a lot of goods come out of in terms of the way that the councils work pulled together, and working as a team and learning from each other. So. I mean, yeah, so that's good to hear that you've had the same experience. Just in terms of your work going forward, do you think there are any areas that you won't be able to? Obviously, you have to prioritise and certain things you can't do that you would have done normally. Are there going to be any areas of the kind of your audit plan that you're concerned that you won't be able to do when in good time, and would that itself lead to any kind of risks in itself? And potentially, if you're going to be spread a bit wide, it sounds like you're working very effectively, but. Yeah, we just still don't know what's happening. I think it's good you've got the rolling, review of your audit plan, but are you concerned that there's going to be things that are going to be left behind and not picked up on just because of where we're at and the nature of things and the priorities and the kind of stretched resources?
I mean, I think it's fair to say in any audit year, there's always things that you wished you had time to do and you didn't. And so I think we'll be following the same process of just reviewing the priorities and risks as we go along. I think if at this moment in time, it's difficult for me to answer that because it's so early in the year. But if I felt that we were in a situation where I felt we couldn't get in to do a specific piece of work that I thought was of significant risk because of resourcing or other things, then I would certainly bring that to the attention of this committee. Or if I felt that we couldn't get in to do sufficient work to enable me to give my annual audit opinion again, that would be something that I would have to raise through this committee. But in this moment in time, I think it's realistic to say that certainly the list of audits that we thought we would do back in March will not be anything like the list we'll end up doing by the end of the year.
Okay, yeah, thanks very well. Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, and I guess that's going to be the same for lots of different parts of the council. But I guess we just got to be aware it's fluid, and it sounds like you've kind of adapting well, and we just got to keep monitoring the situation and adapt as we go along. So that was it for me. Thank you very much for your responses.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, you indicated.
Yeah, so just a few questions, Alex. I'll give you the questions and you can think about how you want to answer them. The skills annex to the 95 days, can you just expand a little bit on that? Because obviously that's a third of the time, and I'm not quite sure I follow what you do there, but that could be my ignorance on that 95 days. So that's in the appendix or annex. Obviously there's a heightened risk against a potential fraud around the discretionary business and the discretionary grant. So would you be looking at that? Where can you use technology more to do that online collaboration, do that detailed testing, think about how you run AMI and that data piece to get the evidence you need to give the full the full assessment of a system. That's the third one. And then I guess from an auditor accountant perspective, you'll not be surprised to say this, on the list of the things you're looking at, there are probably less of an emphasis on the underlying financial systems of the authority than there ever has been. And it probably is something I guess you'll pick up in quarter 3 or 4, but I think it's important to highlight that. And is there some time or some ability even just to do some sort of sense checking, follow up on the things that are outstanding, and maybe just think about some of the systems that the council need to be operating from a financial perspective that could be a focus in in Q1 or 2. But that's just a suggestion, not something you have to change. It just is very evident from the list of the things that you've got there that money talks at the end of the day, and you need to be correcting your revenue, you need to be paying your suppliers on time, and just making sure that payroll system works, all that type of stuff. So that's my question. Sorry, all at once.
No, thank you for that. I'll take them in order if I can, Paul. So the schools work that we do, we've got a statutory requirement to undertake schools audits, because the Section 151 officer has to sign off on that at the end of the year. So this is the work that we do to be able to provide the Section 151 officer with that assurance to sign off that grant statement. So it's difficult to say how we'll do that at this point in time, because obviously the schools haven't been open, so a lot of the work that we would have done in the latter quarter of last year didn't happen. Although I think we'd finished most of our school audit plan by then anyway. It's difficult to think about how those audits might be undertaken, because they would normally be physical school audits where we go out and we do a sort of establishment type review. So we've already had discussions about how we might audit schools remotely, if that's how it's going to be. So the way we audit schools will probably have to change, and it may well mean that we don't spend as many audit days to do it. So one of the things we've talked about is using control risk self-assessment. So getting the schools to do self-assessments of their control environments, and then we would ask for evidence to support that. So instead of actually physically going out to the schools to do that, we would try and do that remotely. We also talked about doing more thematic reviews across. So instead of doing, going out to individual schools, we do thematic reviews of things like payroll or creditors or, governance, that type of thing, where we do a more wide-ranging review across the Kingston schools. So as yet we haven't. We normally don't start our school audit plan anyway till after September, when the schools come back from their school holidays. But it most certainly have to be taking a different approach to how we deliver that work. In terms of the discretionary grant stuff, yes, we will have to have time in there to do some of the post-validation work. It's likely that a lot of that work will be done by the fraud team. So there's sort of two parts to that. One is some checks done by the Counter Fraud Authority. So they'll undertake checks on behalf of the local authorities. And there's also work through the data matching through the National Fraud Initiative. It's called Spotlight. So they'll be undertaking post-validation checks for us to identify fraud, and then we'll have to investigate those matches. As I say, that'll be done through by the fraud team rather than by internal audit. But there might be some support provided by internal audit depending on the volume of work that's done there. So most certainly that's something that we'll have to do to make sure we haven't made erroneous payments to businesses that we shouldn't have done, because we'll have to try and cover some of that money. In terms of developing our IT capability and increasing our use of IT to do sort of data matching on key financials, you're absolutely right, Paul. That's been something that's been on our service plan probably for the last few years, and it's something we've found quite difficult to progress. Like a lot of local authority teams, it's something we all talk about quite a lot in our London audit groups and wider networks about how we develop all of that. And partially it kind of gets put back just because of time, and we always seem to be sort of firefighting, trying to get the audit plans delivered, and actually what it requires is some investment in time and also money to try and get that off the ground. But we all completely recognise that it's off the ground. But we all completely recognise that it's really valuable in terms of giving us greater coverage. In some systems, 100% coverage in terms of our testing, which we wouldn't have through normal audit means. So we have got time in the plan to try and develop that. And in fact, on Annex 2, so sort of linked to the kind of key financial stuff, we've got some work around key financial systems, control mapping and management overrides. So part of that is spending time sort of mapping all of those systems out and developing our IT audit sort of data matching capabilities to try and use the likes of IDEA and Excel to do some sort of wider testing on those. So we've got time in there to try and develop that this year, because as you say, it's really important. So I wouldn't say we've got less emphasis on the key financials this year. I'd actually say we've got more. We're certainly planning to do more around the key financials this year. So I hope that answers all your questions, Paul. Sorry if I've missed anything.
No, thank you. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Alison.
It was actually just to ask a question about the schools. Do you go into, or do we have access to all schools, or is it just maintained schools? Can you go into academies as well?
It's maintained schools,
yeah.
But we have we do actually provide the audit for Coomb Academy.
Okay.
So we do that separately. So that's a separate SLA we've got with Coomb Academy. So that's been quite interesting actually for us to kind of see how academy schools operate compared to maintained schools, and because obviously there were concerns in the early days about the fact that the controls over academy schools were a lot less robust than they were over maintained schools. So it's been really interesting to see that how that works in practice.
Okay. So how are the academies audited then? Is that done?
I'm just going to jump in here with a personal interest that both my children go to Coomb Girls. I don't think it precludes me from the meeting, but just to be absolutely clear, they are both in the Coomb Academy Trust. Do carry on, Alison.
Well, that's fine. So I was just at a point, just from an interest point of view, how are they audited then, the academies?
So they are required to have audit. But it's up to them to procure that audit resource. So that can be from local authorities or from private audit firms. So they've had so Coomb Academy, they had a private audit firm doing their audit previously, but we've been their auditors for the last few years.
Okay.
So and I can confirm that their controls are incredibly robust. So the concerns that I had around academies were certainly not did certainly not come to fruition when we went out to Coomb. I was very impressed with how they operate.
Okay. And the other thing I was just looking at, this South London Waste Partnership, you've got an annual review. Is that something that you have to do? And then it was a follow-on question was about other outsourced contracts that we have as a council. Are they included in your work schedule?
So the South London Waste Partnership, yes, we do have to do an annual review, and it's a joint review with Sutton and Merton. We don't have to review all parts of it. So what we do is review. We do reviews on parts of the contract, not necessarily all of it. In terms of other outsourced, anything's in the domain of audit. So wherever we've got any outsourced functions, that they would still be subject potentially to our audit review.
That was all. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the committee? As Alex said at the beginning, I'm very keen that as members of this committee, we get involved a little bit earlier in the plan that comes forward rather than when it's already almost work in progress. So there will be a separate meeting of the members of the committee to be able to talk through the second half of this year's plan, this financial year's plan, and then again to work on the 21-22 plan and be able to delve a little bit deeper into some of these questions that we've covered a little bit tonight, and we'll see how that goes. But in which case, if there are no other comments, I'll move the recommendation, which is on E1, which is to resolve that the Audit Governance and Standards Committee approves the IA Charter and Strategy and rolling IA Audit Plan for quarters 1 and 2 for 2021. Can I have that seconded, please?
Agreed.
Yep, seconded. Oh, yep. Take it back.
I'll allow Democratic Services to work out who came in first on that one. I think it was Councillor Jürgen Nathan that time. And unless any member of the committee comments in the chat, I will take these recommendations as agreed unanimously. Or all the members of the committee are nodding, so that is unanimously agreed. Thank you very much, Alex. I'm hoping now that Kevin's IT problems have been solved. We have a photo. Can you speak to us, Kevin?
Hopefully, can you hear me?
We can hear you. So we'll move on to the annual fraud update, and over to you, Kevin, to introduce the item. If you could introduce yourself first, that would be great.
So my name's Kevin Holland, and I head up the shared fraud partnership. Same areas and same authorities as covered by the audit partnership. I work to Alex. So fraud and audit do, whilst they're separate partnerships, they do work very closely together. The report itself is a review of work done in the previous financial year. It also starts off with a brief indicative plan of how the resource provided will be applied during this coming year. Just draw members' attention to
Kevin, you're fading out a little bit. If you can just speak a little bit facing the microphone. Yep. When you're facing it, you can't read your notes, I appreciate, but we can hear you much clearer.
Right. If I could point into table 1 on page 72. First comment, you see I'm full of apologies, I'm afraid, is that the table there, it says it's for 1920. It's not, it's for 2021. Unlike audit, it's not, the partnership doesn't work on the acquisition of a set number of days. It is a contingent resources that's put in, and that's then directed to the fraud issues and fraud concerns that arise. The table itself, there is already one adjustment from an earlier draft that I had for April, and that is that I've actually upped the amount of, percentage-wise, the amount of time to spend on planned or proactive fraud work. That's actually there to address the business support grant work and all the post-assurance work that is ongoing, that both Alex at auditors, myself, my team, and colleagues in the revenues team will be looking at. And that's been a big draw on time, shall I say, over the past couple of months. If I then go moving forward, and I'll probably just pick out 1 or 2 tables. I'll probably table 5 on page 74. That's the one that will give hopefully an overview for yourselves of the outcomes of the audit work in the past year and how that compares to previous years. What I can say is that there are no real significant differences there. Fraud exists, it's always there, it's something that's been managed, minimized, but cannot be eradicated because of the fraudster's mindset and fraudster's intent. So what I can say, in the past year, we have found, say, no new real sort of areas of fraud, although because of all the involvement in the business grant works and business rates, and the way that information has been collected on that this year, we do think there's more work that we can do, and that's working collaboratively with not just the 5 boroughs in the partnership, but across London. We do think there's more work we can do to help support that area for the benefits of all the authorities, and we will be working on that. In the year, we have found that in mid-year there was a drop in the referrals on tenancy related issues, and tenancy fraud is an expensive resource, a necessary resource for those who are in need of housing. Because of that drop, some of my officers, they have been out and around the housing departments and other services doing the fraud awareness, trying to remind them of our presence and remind them of what a fraud issue looks like. That did work, and there was a pickup in referrals coming through at the end of the year. Of course, then our investigation work was hampered to some extent by the COVID-19. In that tenancy area, usually if we're going through and finding issues, there will be a visit or an interview or some sort of direct interaction. That got suspended, but I'm telling you before me, we've done our risk assessments for that area of work, and the visits actually started up again 2 weeks ago. So we've done the risk assessment for both for the implications of the public and the officers who are going out and about and doing those visits. So we're starting that area again. I suppose the big one, and again, everyone keeps talking about it, is the impacts of COVID. So whilst this is really a report on last year's work, as I said earlier, we have been doing lots of work across the partnership on the support grants, the support schemes, supporting the frontline refuge teams in terms of upfront validation checks, and there has been some. I know it's been minimal because you need to get the monies out there, but we are also working across all 5 and for Kingston on all the post assurance work that's needed, and the reporting back to BES for the government funding side, and that will be ongoing for a number of months. If I could, I was just picking up probably on, I think it was Paul's question, but what has happened in this COVID-19 period is that whilst audit and fraud do work closely together, picking up on Alex's response, we've had even closer working arrangements between audit and fraud, more joint working type audits, well, fraudits, I think we call them, being planned, and the auditors in their work being more open to areas of fraud, and likewise the fraud investigators, when they're reviewing their piece of work, being more open to try to identify whether there are any control issues or control weaknesses that can be fed back into the internal audit process. So I think that's all I'd like to say, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Oh, right, okay, I didn't even need to say put it in chat. Paul's already in there. Paul, please ask Kevin.
Sorry, just too keen. Kevin, I've just got a few questions. The 10% of the plan that wasn't delivered, what were the gaps, and were there any that we need to be aware of? Fraud, well, I'll just do them all at once, and so you can have them and you can think about how you want to. The fraud training that was designed and rolled out, was that mandatory to everyone in the council? So you've mentioned that you produced some fraud training that the officers and everyone in the council could have a look at. And then my final question, just so I'm understanding this right, you allocate 20% of your book of work, about 100 days, to look at employee related or internal fraud, but there's only been 4 cases of that. So does that mean every case of that gets 20 days? So just to help me understand that, maybe I'm reading it wrong. So that was my 3 questions. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So in order, the 10%. So I have held on to vacancies. I think I've mentioned previously to this committee, but for those who weren't there, I have. I was involved in a group working with central government in creating a fraud investigator apprenticeship, and that's been approved. So there is money available to draw down from the levies now to employ a trainee investigator. I've held some vacancies because I want to get in some new blood, some fresh blood into the investigation streams, and to put them through that training course. Whilst the apprenticeship scheme was approved last year, we've only just got the first training provider on board and properly accredited. So they have places starting in September, so I'll be looking to recruit. So what that means is across the partnership for me, I've been carrying vacancies. So where the resource hasn't been allocated, fully utilised by individual authorities, they will get a refund, a reimbursement off of this current year's fee. And that's something that I work on with Alex and report to the shared service board, headed up by the directors. That's how that 10% is addressed. In terms of concerns over fraud, obviously, the more resource I can, I think the more we'll be able to deal with. The idea of the partnership is that if there were a flood of referrals, I can pull in resources just to address those. And in the past year, there has been an authority who may have had more than their, say, contingent amount because of their fraud concerns. Those are all discussed at the shared service board and aligned with the directors. And my job is to manage a report to them to say that, well, if authority A has had more resource in year one, that will get balanced over, a 2 or 3 year cycle. If it's not able to be balanced, then they will have to pay an additional amount. And they only get that addition so long as it's not at a real loss or expense to any other individual partner. So that's that first one. The training. So the training package is mandatory, and it is mandatory for all staff. There have been issues with the platform that it's on. So whilst it's mandatory for all staff, we have been working with the HR colleagues in being able to extract enough reliable information of the exact take-up and completion of it. So I understand it's part of the induction process for new entrants, and they're the ones easy to pick up. It's existing staff and making sure that they have undertaken the training. Packages developed by us, it's then given across to each authority for them to run. But it is, for Kingston, it is mandatory, one of the mandatory items for all staff. And the third item on the employee split, sorry, on that first table, that split of resource is the reactive resource. So those percentage splits are not about the whole resource. It's just I think the 60% reactive element. It does reduce it down a bit. But employee cases do take an awful lot longer, per se, than many other fraud types. We do lots of work in supporting both, say, the fraud side, but say internal disciplinary investigations and working with HR. And they unfortunately, by their nature, they are more time and labour intensive to address.
Okay, Paul.
Yeah, cool. Sorry, thank you.
Any other members of the committee got any questions? I'm not saying there's just a couple of things that, while you've been talking, Kevin, have occurred to me. The first one is on the fraud training. I've been around so long, we wouldn't have had fraud training at my induction as a counsellor. I don't recall having fraud training at the every 4 years induction that we do. So it may well be worth making that available to members. We meet a lot of, when we're out door knocking, we meet a lot of people where you're going, that's not what's on the electoral roll here. And actually you're just querying what doesn't feel right very occasionally, which might be in council accommodation or where it, so I think it would be useful to have some kind of member training if we can arrange that. And forgive me if you have run it and I have always missed it. I will not next time.
Yeah. So for this particular committee, there has been some training on fraud and what we do and what to look out for, but that wouldn't cover all members. So outside of this, I'll speak to Fiona and see how the training can be made available. It's an online training package. It takes 45 minutes to an hour, I think, to go through. But I'll speak to Fiona to see how that can be made available to members.
Yeah, and I think that all members may well be interested. Did you want to come in on this point particularly, Rowena, or just generally?
Well, I was going to agree with you anyway, but I'm happy to wait my turn.
Okay. Well, the other thing that is about the communications. So, you know, obviously we read occasionally about one of the blue badge frauds that you catch, and who isn't appalled by somebody misusing a blue badge, stolen or fraudulently used. But there's a lot of others, and I'm not talking about the individual circumstances for a lot of them, but I think it would be really good to work with the comms team at the council, because people need to know fraud. We will be investigating you if we hear about it from your tenancy, or if you claim single person council tax discount or anything else. We will look into it, and if we find proof, we will prosecute you. You know, there is no two ways about it. We don't agree, we don't accept fraud as just part of life, although I hear what you say about we can never completely eliminate it, just try and stay one step ahead. But also I think it makes people feel better, those of us not committing fraud, than actually you and your team are out there looking for it. And people will grass up, sorry to use the expression, but tell on their neighbours. Yes. And we want them to tell on their neighbours, because we will only prosecute once we've got actual evidence. We won't just take their word for it. It's just the start of the process. So I wondered if you'd take working with the comms team and trying to up the amount of information that comes out. Because I do read all the council press releases, and we don't often get something on the Twitter feed or anything that's around fraud.
I will take to do that and do regular exercises. I mean, across the party, we have talked about you know, sometimes it's the headline numbers and figures that prompt people, and I can do a report based on the partnership, so it pulls in the other numbers. They may not be particular to Kingston, but that does mean to say that that fraud activity isn't going on. And then on the tenancy side, we did have, as I said, with the drop-off of referrals and the extra training, we did have some leaflets done and printed off for the housing offices, and some were put up on some of the estate notice boards and things, and that did have an effect, as you say, that if the public are able to get to us quickly and easily enough, you know, there are people out there who are willing. They just have to find the right ear to speak to.
Yeah, absolutely, and I don't expect you to be comms experts, because you're fraud experts. So talk to the comms team about how to communicate it out in the most effective way, because they're the comms experts. So that would be great. Thank you. Rowena.
Yeah, no, I was going to put my name in the chat anyway, but I do agree with you. I think it is worth all councillors having some training, because we are out there talking to lots of people, and it can be school fraud, it can be blue badge fraud or tenancy fraud, all sorts of stuff, and people will come to us. But actually, the thing I particularly wanted to ask about was the blue badge fraud, because I know that's something that I know financially it's not always the biggest bit, but it is a thing that's of concern to residents. And I presume the permit fraud relates to blue badge. And I know there's going to be lots of fraud work on all the benefits that have had to pay out because of COVID. But I just wondered what emphasis there was on blue badge fraud. So that was my question. But one other comment. So I do seem to remember, because I've been on this committee for a long time, that there did used to be press releases. And if there are any local Kingston ones, if we can get those out, because general ones are good, but people do relate more to local stuff. It's just that deterrent, really. Yes.
So you, on that, you are right in saying that the permit fraud is 90% of, I think for Kingston, 100% of its blue badge. Elsewhere, we've actually been working with some authorities where there's a pattern of people appealing PCN charges with false and bogus claims. I mean, to say, you know, we've got one area where it's a vehicle that's broken down and invoices to 15 separate PCN challenges from the same garage, whilst the garage is there, they're not the ones who've issued those invoices. So that's a worrying growing trend. So it's looking to address that. Within the fraud partnership, I do have someone in the team who their particular lead is on the blue badge abuse, and I'll check with him to see how he is in liaising with Kingston's own parking enforcement teams, because that's usually where some of the members of the public's inquiries are directed towards, and it's just making sure that those are properly challenged through to him. I'll work on blue badge. It is a bit labour intensive. Most of ours, where we take for prosecution, we will do them for a consistent, persistent abuse. So we will undertake surveillance work, and we will look to see 3 separate occasions of arriving and departing for us to take those cases forward to make more of an example. And they're the ones that there are some here, but those are the ones that I understand that you want to get out in those press releases.
Oh, thanks for that. And perhaps I should declare an interest. So I've just challenged the PCN today because I had a permit on the car, but never mind. I'm sure they'll sort that one.
I'm sure if it's legitimate, you'll pay it, Rowena, and if it's not, you'll put it through the normal systems. Oh, thank you, Kevin. Nobody else has indicated they wish to speak. I find this area fascinating, and I think it's one of those things when we were saying with audit that we want to become, I'd like the committee to become more involved in what's being looked at, and taking your professional advice, obviously, but maybe we can follow that up between formal committee meetings, like informal committee meetings, to be able to understand a little bit more about it. I'm actually going to add to the recommendation what we talked about that I think people were agreeing with, which is just, so I'll move the recommendation as it stands to resolve that the fraud work undertaken and performance results for 1920 be noted, and then just add in that members, councillors in Kingston, I'll leave to the officers, but that councillors in Kingston are able to access and encouraged, or words to that effect, the fraud training that is available for staff, and that communications to partners and the wider community are increased. I don't want to put pressure on any facts and figures that you have to perform in a certain way, just to highlight that that's what the committee feels is a way that we should be increasing the recognition of the work that you do in the fraud department. So do I have a seconder for the recommendation with that addition? Councillor Holt, are you indicating?
Yes, I'll second that.
Okay, thank you. Fiona, can I just check you're happy with understanding the wording I'm trying to put into the additional recommendation?
Yes, Chair. Could you just clarify again the second part of that regarding comms?
I'm not sure. It's basically to say that working with the comms team, increase the recognition of the fraud work that happens. You need to pick better words.
Okay, I've got that.
Yeah. Thank you, Fiona. I hope everybody understands the ethos of what I'm trying to say there. So I've moved and seconded the recommendation with that slight, with that addition, small addition. I've had a seconder. I'll take the recommendations as unanimously agreed, and as a colleague indicates to the contrary in the chat function, in which case we'll go to a roll call vote. Are those unanimously agreed? The members of the committee are nodding and nothing is in the chat function, so we unanimously agree that. And thank you very much, Kevin, for the report and the work that you do in fraud.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we will move back to item 4, which is the Treasury Management Annual Report, which is Rachel Howard to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. So the report here sets out the Council's Treasury Management activities for 1920, or a summary of them. It's really around the debt levels throughout the year remain prudent, and the revenue costs of financing the of that debt continue to be prudent, and our investment priorities continue to be around the security, liquidity, and then yield in that order of our the things we look at when we're looking at our investment decisions. On the debt side, we've maintained an under-borrowed position through the year. It means our underlying need to borrow, known as our capital financing requirement or CFR, has not been fully supported by loan debt. That's not an uncommon position to take. But interest rates have remained low throughout the year, so there was an additional loan taken on back in September. I think the other point to note around on the debt side is activity that's ongoing with the Public Works Loans Board. There's been some sudden and sharp changes to their loan terms and interest rates throughout the year, which has primarily been aimed at trying to curb local authorities' investments in commercial property. And there's a consultation ongoing around further changes to their lending terms, which closes on Friday, and we will be responding to. So they're kind of the key points on the debt side. On the investment side, in line with the interest rates on the debt side, really, the rates of return remain low due to various things kind of going on in the economy, not least Brexit and COVID-19. However, in amongst all of that position, the interest rates the council have achieved on our investments been an average rate of return of 0.92%. It's in table at the top of page C7, which is around 0.39% above the target that we aim to achieve. So it's still making a significant contribution towards the council's financial position. So that's a really brief summary, but happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Please do indicate in the chat if you would like to ask any questions of Rachel. So we've kept Rachel here until this time, and none of us have any questions on Treasury management. Fair enough.
Chair, Mr. Ergley has a question.
Ah, sorry, I didn't see.
Rachel, I didn't want you to get away scot-free, so I thought I just want, because obviously this report was produced as at the end of the financial year, and a lot has changed since then. So, is there any new or emerging issues that we need to think about or be flagged? And I get the sense that, you know what I mean, getting interest, any form of interest going forward is going to be quite difficult to achieve, just with the letters you get through the post, and when it's saying your eyes is basically worth nothing. So is there any revision to the council overall strategy for treasury management that needs to be taken on board as a result? And then I guess that depends on the length of where we are just now in terms of the COVID situation. So two questions there.
Thank you. So in terms of new or emerging issues, I think the PWLB consultation that I mentioned is probably the key thing on the horizon, which is really the proposals within that consultation are they're aiming to restrict access to debt financing from the PWLB for authorities who are undertaking what they call debt for yield activities, so purchasing assets solely for making a return. However, the proposals as they stand would restrict access to that source of funding, not just for those projects, but for any project occurring in a year when you're also doing that. So if you're carrying out some debt for yield activity, investment in commercial property, say, but also doing routine kind of council capital activity, whether that be housing or infrastructure investment that you would finance through debt, it would restrict access for those types of projects as well, which is where our major source of concern with the proposal is, and which we will be responding to in the consultation that closes this week. So that for me is the kind of biggest issue on the horizon, and the kind of changes that will make in terms of our sources that we've got access to external funding on. In terms of the interest rate environment, I mean, I suppose on the investment side, as I say, our primary concern is always around the security of our funds and ensuring that we have cash available. Any investments we make do come back to us, and that we have the cash available when we need it. But that said, obviously, we do try and maximise the amount of income we get from it at the same time. Cash flow's been, a lot higher up the agenda, I think, through the past 3 or 4 months through the COVID response than it has been on a lot of local authorities' radar for a long time, due to the kind of level of cash we've been trying to get out the door quickly to pay suppliers more quickly, and those sorts of things. We keep a very close eye on our cash management activity generally, but it's fair to say, other senior officers and externally have been giving that greater scrutiny and concern, and it's not been a major cause of concern for Kingston through that response period. But actually, our cash flows have been managed effectively through that period, so that's not been a particular concern. I hope that answers your question. Apologies if I missed anything in that.
No, that was great. Thank you, Rachel.
And I should know better than to say nobody's got any questions, because that prompts councillors to ask questions. I won't make that mistake again. Mark was next.
Thank you, Chair. So you touched on a couple of the points I was going to mention, but yeah, regarding the PWLB, so I sit on Guildhall Capital as one of the directors, so maybe got particular interest in that decision coming up. If it were the case that we weren't able to borrow from them, if we were to carry out, was it borrowing full yield or something along those lines, or borrowing to invest in commercial property, would we be able to have, there would be other sources of, obviously there'd be other sources of loans or you're borrowing. At the moment, are you able to say whether they're kind of, in terms of what the rates are, would they be similar? Would we be significantly worse off or worse off at all if we went elsewhere? Potentially, I guess, it's all subject to kind of, going through the application process, but as things stand, would that make us potentially a lot worse off when it comes to borrowing money?
It's hard to say exactly in terms of rates. So one of the other sources to look at would be the Municipal Bonds Agency that was set up a number of years ago, but finally recently issued their first bond at rates that were actually lower than the PWLB. I think the key thing to note is not necessarily around some of the interest rates, so it's obviously a key factor, is around the accessibility. So the PWLB is a very easily accessible facility. We can call them up, and within 2 days we have the money in our bank. To the governance and arrangements we need to put in place to access funding through some of those other routes would be more complex and take longer to put in place. So that would be kind of one of the bigger impacts, as well as concerns around rates. Through private markets, it's likely rates are probably higher than PWLB, but it would all depend on exactly what was going on in the market at that point in time. So it's hard to say precisely.
Yeah. I understand, thank you. And just very quickly following on from that, so if we were to, so if the council were to borrow to kind of purchase property in the borough, would that still potentially fall, as things stand, again, I guess that's caveats, would that still fall under kind of borrowing for yield, if I've got that expression correctly, and then preclude us from borrowing from the PWLB? Would that be kind of outside terms that they lay down?
So one of the areas we, and I know London councils have been looking at this as well across London, that we've kind of been feeding back as part of that consultation, is that their definitions of debt for yield are not 100% clear, so there is some ambiguity in there. I think my reading of it at the moment is that if you was investing in borough but just for return as opposed to for any other kind of purpose, it would probably fall foul of the new rules. But I think where it's unclear is where you've got quite often projects that have multiple purposes. You might be doing it to earn a return, but also for housing need or regeneration, or building infrastructure. There are projects that have multiple facets to them, and that's where the proposals as they currently stand aren't clear enough.
Okay, yeah, understood. There's lots of unknown still. Thank you very much, Rachel. That's very helpful.
Alison.
Yeah, I think Rachel has probably answered part of my question anyway. It was to do with cash flow and the impact, because we have had to pay things out as a council, and also perhaps not receiving money in and council tax. So it was just to sort of make sure that we, you know, that is a reasonable cash flow position that we've got there. We've got cash at the end of the, but is that in the post year end? Is that still the position?
Yeah, there's no significant issues with our cash flow at the moment. Whilst the pandemic hitting when it did, actually April is normally the kind of high point in terms of our cash flow, and the end of March the low point in terms of how our funding flows throughout the course of the year. And whilst we have seen lower levels of income being collected through April, May, June than usual, we're still getting significant sums in from the majority of residents who are still able to pay their council tax, for example. And on the business rate side, we've had where additional reliefs and so on have been granted to businesses. We've had grant that compensates us for that, and that's significant sums of that have been paid up front. So that's kind of helped the situation as well.
Thank you, and thank you, Rachel. If there's no other comments from members or questions, I think this is just a for information item, and therefore we don't need a recommendation or to vote on it. Is that correct, Fiona?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. So thank you, Rachel, and we're moving on to the last but by no means least item, and thank you for your patience, Lauren, which is the new model code of conduct for members. Lauren, would you introduce it, please?
Thank you, Chair. I am Lauren McCann. I am the Authorities Monitoring Officer and General Counsel. So this report sets out to seek the committee's views on the Local Government Association's consultation on a new model code of conduct for elected members. So at Annex 2, there are some suggested responses to the consultation, and I welcome the committee's views on those responses, but in particular, question 1, which is about when a member is deemed to be acting in their capacity as an elected member and when the code will apply. Question 4, which is with regard to gifts and hospitality and what the appropriate amount is for that to be recorded. And question 10, which looks at whether there is sufficient reference to social media in the code, and whether there should be a separate code on social media, or whether that should be incorporated into the current model code. And then at question 11, which is amendments to the way that interests are declared. So I'd be grateful for your views on those specific points, and also more broadly any comments and suggestions and amendments on the response as a whole.
Sorry. Thank you, Lauren. Could members indicate in the chat if they have questions and comments? No. Well, right, Paul, thank you.
Just to get the ball rolling, and it'd be interesting to get your perspective on it again, I guess, as councillors. I always try and explain this to, when I was doing my roles and on to my mum and dad, what would a layperson think when they read it, and it's out there. And the bit that's always has always stood out to me in this is what's an acceptable amount of money, and I mean, you can come and go, and I think the 50k, I wish, the £50 sounds like a good figure. The bit for me that I guess sticks out a little bit is the 28 days to declare that. Seems quite a long time to really register an interest or register a gift, but I think I've been told in previous meetings that is the standard and not really up for debate piece. But I think that's probably the one thing that jumped out to me. If it's something that is you feel that you need to declare and is in the public interest to declare that, I think it would be probably in everyone's interest to do it quicker, but I'm not quite sure what the committee think of that. That would be my first comment.
Thank you. Lauren, can you just comment on the standardness of it?
That is a standard it's a standard number of days. I think it's in order to give people time to be able to report it to myself and Democratic Services.
And allowing for holiday of the person you've ended up reporting it into. I think it's the same for all officers as well, isn't it? For their code of conduct is 28 days, and it's usually 28 days for claiming back expenses. So I think it's a fairly standard thing, although I'd hope in most circumstances it happened quicker. Alison.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably sort of mirror what Paul has said. I think it is, you know, I think the amount is well, it seems quite small, but then I think it is just gets you into the habit of doing it, and the 28 days is, you know, I think is a reasonable amount of time. I just think it's making sure that members are aware that it has to be done, sort of reminding. So nothing in this paper that I sort of necessarily disagree with. I just wondered about the next stage, just, you know, what we do as a council at the moment. Do we would we just do we normally just incorporate all of these things into our code of conduct?
Well, so at the moment it's only at the consultation stage. So we will put in our response to the consultation. The LGA will gather the responses and will formulate the model code, which I think we're expecting around the autumn. So I will bring back a second report which sets out what the code actually says. It isn't mandatory, so we don't have to adopt it in its entirety. We may well wish to do so, or there might be things that we want to tweak to add a more local perspective. And so we can talk that through and make those recommendations at a committee in the autumn, and then to make the actual changes to the constitution that will need to go through full council.
Rowena.
Yep, thank you. So, Lauren, you were asking for comments on some of those points. So, I mean, I welcome kind of any more guidance on the interest, and I think, you know, it's very important that people are tight on that. And I do actually think 28 days is fine. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the social media, because that's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's a way of talking, really. You know, we can talk out loud and we talk on social media. So I suppose the question is, what sort of things were you thinking of? And I just think personally, I think, you know, much as I don't like a lot of the banter that goes on, and a lot of times it's, you know, a bit of a knockabout between politicians and stuff like that. And obviously you have to be careful of all the sensitivities. But I think we've got to be a bit careful with free speech. And I know as a political party through the Conservatives, and I'm sure the Lib Dems are the same, and other parties, we do have some sort of censure from our party, because obviously we don't want to bring our parties into disrepute. And obviously voters, if they don't like things that we've said, then obviously they'll make that clear, and then there's voting. So I think we've got to be very careful that we maintain sort of free speech in all ways. And I just wondered what way this was going.
I think a lot of the problems that arise at the moment arise from social media. So I think the intention is to try and get a little bit more clarity around how do we make that clear when councillors are acting in their capacity as a councillor, and when they are acting in their capacity as a private individual, and then more broadly around whether or not a separate, whether that's built into the model code of conduct, so the social media elements of it would sit within the code, or whether they're dealt with separately. So currently I believe we already have a code around social media and sort of assistance to help councillors understand how to toe that line. And so my view is that actually the obligations that are set out in the code of conduct are kind of implicit in how you do behave, whether that's on social media or not, if you're acting in your capacity as a councillor. So whether that actually needs to go into the model code, I'm not sure. I think it does, because it's inherent in the nature of the things that are being required of you in any event.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I was getting at, because we're all supposed to, we all subscribe obviously to the Nolan Code, and obviously social media is another way of communicating. I mean, certainly if there's stuff, I mean, certainly there's some things that be clear cut. So if you're acting as a councillor, or say, for example, you put on social media, I don't think I've ever seen it, but say if someone put on social media something was in the exempt papers, or, you know, something as clear cut as that. But if it was more kind of guidelines rather than I suppose rules. And also it's quite difficult, that divide between what you do as a councillor sometimes and what you do as a politician of your party as well, and it is quite different. So it is a kind of tricky area. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think
not to be, hopefully it wouldn't be too prescriptive, the sorts of things that you would be coming up with.
Well, and I think that's what the model code is trying to get at, actually, is trying to weigh that balance. And I think it sounds like what you're telling me is that you think that it shouldn't be contained within the model code of conduct, and that should be dealt with as a separate code with guidance and recommendations to councillors on how they manage that, and how we make it very clear that social media interactions apply just as much as they would if they were face-to-face interactions or in a more traditional form of written communication.
Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so it was about social media as well. So it is obviously quite a tricky one. I'm just thinking, it's about. I think it's similar to what Councillor Bass was saying. So it can be a bit blurred, I think, on social media, where the lines are where personal and political combine. Because, for example, I've got a Twitter account. I don't know how many tweets I've sent out. It's less than a handful, but it is just me. But then people have started tweeting me as a councillor, and sometimes just including me in general conversations, or sometimes a bit more pointed kind of communications, and you kind of tempted to reply robustly back to them, which I've resisted that temptation. And you've got to take you've got to behave within a certain way as a councillor, obviously. But it's just that seems a bit blurred when I'm being approached. And the other thing is, I guess, if you're face to face, someone says something to you, that's relatively private. If someone's saying something to you, potentially. It works both ways. Obviously, if we were saying something to residents, it can be very public, and what you want to sometimes come back, and it's certain with a certain forceful reply if someone said something that you think is inappropriate or wrong or kind of defaming you. So I guess it's just it is. I don't think I'm going to help resolve everything, but it's just highlighting that how difficult it is, and the fact there is that blur when people got accounts. I don't know if we should have. Do we have a policy where we have official? If we're using social media, we should have an official kind of council account for council. Okay, so the chair doesn't like that at all. I don't know, just putting suggestions out there. But I think it's going to have to take. I don't think it's as easy as just transferring the policy that we've got for the standard policy pre-social media and just transposing that to social media. I think it's a bit more nuanced and a different kind of approach might need to be taken. That was it for me. Thank you.
I think that was a comment, and Lauren can come back. I've got some thoughts on this, as Lauren knows. And on the first thing that you asked about, which is when you're acting in capacity as a member, there is clearly a difference, and obviously it's more than just at these meetings. There is clearly a difference if you have arranged a site visit with some residents to look at a traffic issue or whatever it is. You're acting in your capacity as a member. You're there because you're a councillor. That's really quite clear. If you're doing a piece of casework for somebody, you're there as a councillor. But there's a world of difference between that and going out for an evening with a couple of friends that you've known for years and maybe having a bit of a row over Brexit or something, some national issue where you are not acting as a councillor, you're acting as an individual who happens to disagree with a friend or colleague. You are not, and you're speaking on behalf of yourself. And I think that to have the code, I would use different language speaking to a friend I disagreed with over some issue than I would ever use with a resident where I was acting in my capacity. And I think I should be entitled to do that. So I think that your suggested response, that we agree to a small extent, because we do agree that it's more than formal council business, but it's whether, and I think the important words, giving the impression that you're acting as a councillor, I think that is part of it. And that also falls into the one that you put down on interests. it's what the old, I was always taught it as the Clapham omnibus test, and Paul calls it what would his parents say. It is given the full piece of it, the full information, what would a normal person think of that? Would they think you'd acted appropriately or inappropriately? And I think that has to remain the test, and should be the test. And I think we should make that clear, because you cannot put in the code every single circumstance that may come up, because there are just too many of them. So I think having that, what would a reasonable person reasonably think if they had all of the facts available to them, has to be the ultimate test, both in terms of were you giving the impression or claiming or acting on as a counsellor, and indeed in terms of the interests that you have. I know one member of our group that spoke to me about it. She has a very large extended family. She does not know what some of them do for a job, let alone who for, and therefore couldn't, they may be a relatively close relative in terms of description, a cousin or something, but if they don't know where they work or who they work for, how can they possibly declare it as an interest? Because they don't have that information. So I think that, again, needs to be reasonably covered. The very quick one is, I think £50 is the correct limit. If that is what's being recommended by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, I see no reason why we should respond anything different to what they think. They will have researched it. And then finally, on the social media one, I was making faces at the idea of a council social media account, because then when you are in opposition, you cannot criticise the council. Now, Rowena, in her role in opposition, may well wish to criticise what the council is doing, and is quite within her rights to criticise some of the things we're doing, because if they'd been in control, they might have done something differently. And that's part of the role as an opposition councillor. So I don't agree that you should have a councillor one. I don't think it should be in the model code. I agree with Rowena. It is essentially a different form of communication, but it is communication. Whether you're on the phone to somebody, you've written to somebody, you've emailed somebody, you're meeting them face to face, the Nolan principle, as a councillor, the Nolan principles apply. But a protocol, as we have at the moment on social media, just helps us navigate some of the social media problems that are around. But also, I think it should cover the problems the other way. There's a lot of abuse to councillors from people on social media, unacceptable abuse, not disagreeing with a policy. I know a lot of people who have received threats via social media, and just downright rude, horrible comments, and particularly it's aimed at women, but there are men that receive it as well. And you should be in your right to just go block, stop that person, because that's not acceptable. Argue whether you agree or disagree with policies that may be coming out, but do not insult the person that is there, because that is just socially wrong, full stop. So I think a separate code that covers both those aspects of social media, rather than incorporating it into the code, would be my take on it. And I have spoken to a few people within the administration as well, and they have agreed with that. Does anybody else have any comments? Rowena, do you want to come back on something?
Yeah, there's actually, you said quite a few things that I wanted to say, because I think we just have to remember as well, as councillors aren't employees, so obviously you would have a very different code. So I mean, we have quite a lot of, I suppose, discipline or whatever you get from your association or your party or whatever, because you don't want to bring your own party into dispute, you don't want to bring the council into dispute. But we're not employees, that's not the way it's set up. So I think it's very important we sign up to the Nolan Code. I think it's very important that anything legally you have to do, like interests, register of interests and all of that, is done. But I do think we've got to be quite careful that if anything, it's guidance and we're not too prescriptive, because it does go the other way, because I've had some quite horrid kind of threats and stuff like that, and we don't have the protection of employees either, because it's accepted that as councillors, as politicians, you just have to take rough and tumble of that. And I have to say, officers have been very good when that is the case, and they do take on the case because, you know, people know where we live. It, you know, it can be quite frightening, really. So we are in that position. So, you know, guidance both ways is quite good. But I think, you know, I wouldn't really be for council setting up Twitter accounts. It's another form of communication. I mean, you could have a journalist that phones you up and you say something very inappropriate that would get out. I think we each of councillors have got to basically follow the Nolan Code.
Thank you, Rowena. I mean, I think that you're agreeing that when it applies, the particular 4 questions that Lauren asks in the report, that it applies when we're acting as a counsellor, not necessarily 100% of the time when we're acting in our private life.
That wasn't quite what I said. I was like, I'd say take the whole thing in the round, and it's kind of, you sign up to the Nolan Code, which, so there is it's quite a difficult divide between the two. I just think as a counsellor, whatever, I think you don't want to be too prescriptive on, you know, on what speech you're allowed to use, really. I think it's up to counsellors with guidance, really.
I think the thing is, though, we need to come up, so we don't have to adopt the model code of conduct when it comes out from the LGA. What we do need to do is to respond in the next couple of days to the LGA consultation. So the question that is asked, which is in the papers on paragraph 12 on F2, is to what extent do you support the proposal that councils demonstrate behaviours set out in the code when they are publicly acting as, identifying as, or giving the impression that they're acting as a counsellor, including when they're on official council business and when using social media. But in the model code in paragraph 9, there's sort of 2 options, which is claiming or giving the impression you are acting in your capacity as a member, or in public in your capacity as a member. And the feeling is that the second of those options, in public, implies, regardless of whether you're acting as a member or, as in my circumstance, having a bit of a discussion with a friend in a public place. So we need to give a steer on that. And Lauren suggested responses in paragraph 13 that we agree to a small extent, but the proposed wording seems to be too wide if it was the second one of those options. Do we agree? I'll get to the formal recommendation in a minute, but do we agree that?
I agree with you.
You do, and others, can you nod if you agree? I'm seeing nods, thank you. The second one is on the interests, and there's a big paragraph at paragraph 14, and it's connected with the relative and close associate not being defined. We don't have a recommended response, I don't think, on the papers for that, Lauren. Can you just clarify?
Sorry, if you bear with me a moment.
So it stops at paragraph 22, where you do talk about the old code of the reasonableness Clapham omnibus test.
So the suggestions around interests in the model code, I think, are quite onerous on councillors, and so I think at paragraph 20 it sort of sets out where I think the difficulty lies. So there's not only the issue in respect of, well, who is a close associate, who is a family member, what are you expected to know about your close associates' interests in order to declare them, but it sets out 2 different ways that you have to then determine what role you can play in a meeting, and those are whether it affects the your close associate or relative, or directly relates to. And I think it's onerous on councillors to have to determine what is actually quite a finely balanced decision on every occasion that you're coming to debate an item. And so I think it needs to be far more clear cut than that, and just remain as the reasonableness test as to whether or not you remain in the item or not.
Yeah. And I think also that puts a lot of pressure on you as monitoring officer, because we'll constantly be going, right, great Aunt Beryl was working for, and you've got to navigate our families and our close associates, as well as the actual things that they do. So your recommendation is that we put in a comment that we go to the reasonableness test for whether an interest is declarable and whether it is a pecuniary or a personal interest. Is that right?
So it will be in respect of personal interests.
Ah, okay. Do we agree with that recommendation from Lauren? I'm taking these individually because I think there's quite a few bits.
Sorry, can I just shout in? I think we do have to be really careful on that, because it's not just onerous on us. It could be, so I agree with you, Lauren, but we have to be very careful that we don't do things that are going to put people off becoming counsellors as well.
Very good point, and actually I think you should have that in the explanation, Lauren. That, you know, we want people to be able to feel free to stand for counsel and not be put off. Any other thoughts on that?
It does seem to be moving away from the spirit of the guidance to a formal checklist. If you're in this scenario, you do this. If you're in this scenario, you do that, which to me takes away any element of judgment, which being an auditor is probably a little bit odd for me to say. That isn't particularly helpful in some instances, isn't it? So I wonder if we mention the spirit of the guidance and the interest, the way that you're acting and behaving, and you know, I mean, you can seek counsel in each other, and you can ask the committee, you can ask, you know what I mean, the head of your party, or you can go to Lauren. Those mechanisms and avenues are still there. They're not being taken away. And what you don't want is a manual produced at the end of it whereby everyone has to read it, and before you say anything you can go, yeah, I'm now clear to speak. That's how it reads to me as well.
That's very well put, Paul. And as the independent member, it's really useful to get your thoughts on it. So are you everyone happy with that? Yeah.
Yeah, can I just say, I don't think there was anything wrong with the old system, really, because we all had to consider whether we had an interest. It usually comes up in planning. We talked to the officer, get advice, but at the end of the day, it was our decision.
Yeah, I do agree, Rowena. So are you happy, Lauren, with what you need to word around that?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. I just wanted to add just a point in respect of the issues that you sometimes face as counsellors on the receiving end of social media. And as a broader part of this piece of work, the Local Government Association is looking at civility in public life, and they have prepared a counsellor's guide to handling intimidation, which I can circulate to all counsellors after this committee, so that that's readily available.
Yeah, please do. That would be very useful. Thank you, Lauren. And then on the social media one, I think most people were saying that it doesn't need its own, it doesn't need to be incorporated as a part of the code because it's just another form of communication, but that protocols, guidance, a code around it is a separate one is useful because of the very specific nature of social media, different to a phone call or a face-to-face meeting. Is that people, do they agree with that view? Happy with that? I'm looking at you, Rowena, trying to work out whether you're happy with that or not.
Well, I think it just comes down to reasonable judgment, really. And I just think I wouldn't really want anything more in the way of codes, because I mean, I just think it's another form of communication, and it should be just in the Nolan thing. But I accept if other people have different views. And I completely hear what Paul was saying, because it just has to come down to judgment. We don't want to have to go through a sort of checklist. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you feel that you're influenced by someone you know in a decision you've made, and you have to make that judgment.
Absolutely.
I do get the impression you would tell each other anyway if you thought you were in that situation quite.
Well, the way it tends to work in a planning meeting, say if you knew someone, you would say that, or that's generally, and you know, you would exempt yourself from the meeting or something like that. So it's very rare, though.
Yeah. So essentially, we don't think that social media should be incorporated into the general code, and councils can, at their own wish, provide protocol or guidance. And that can be a larger debate for Kingston councillors. I know we have some protocols at the moment, whether we wish to keep those when the model code comes back to us for potential adoption or change. So is that clear, Lauren?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
And are we happy with the £50 level for hospitality and gifts? as that's been suggested by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. I think they probably know what they're talking about. Yeah. Okay, so we've gone through each of the 4 items individually, but the recommendation on the front is that the monitoring officer be authorised to complete and submit the response at Annex 2, subject to the amendments made by the committee at the meeting. Well, we've essentially agreed and made some slight nuances within those, Lauren, that you have. I move that recommendation. Is there a seconder?
I'll second.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I will take the recommendations as agreed unanimously unless a colleague indicates to the contrary in the chat function or calling out, in which case I would move to a vote by roll call. So are we agreeing unanimously? I can see nods from the members, so we are agreeing that unanimously. Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you all the officers for staying with us. There are no urgent items authorised by the chair, so that concludes the business this evening. The time is 10:15. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you. Well done.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.